Welcome to Mind Shield. We protect the mind and pursue the truth. Let's get started.
Today's presentation examines a dangerous blind spot in modern psychiatry. The possibility that some symptom clusters assumed to be purely internal may also resemble externally induced effects. This deck argues that rapid advances in neurotechnology, directed energy research, and cognitive warfare have created what it calls a clinical mimic of schizophrenia. The point is not to replace one certainty with another. The point is to widen the frame, so diagnosis is not driven by habit, stigma, or institutional convenience. If medicine ignores the environment, it risks mistaking assault for illness. The first clue is demographic. Standard schizophrenia onset tends to cluster much earlier in life, but the profile presented here is different. High-functioning adults, often stable professionals, reporting sudden late-onset voices, surveillance sensations, and highly specific technical complaints. That mismatch matters. When a pattern does not fit the expected age curve, content profile, or functional history, clinicians should not force it into a familiar box. In medicine, an outlier is not always noise. Sometimes it is the first crack in an old model. This slide introduces the Frey effect, also called the microwave auditory effect. The core idea is that pulsed radio frequency energy can create pressure waves that are perceived as sound inside the head. In this framing, the issue is not mystical mind reading. It is biophysics. The deck highlights thermoelastic expansion, cochlear involvement, and auditory processing as a mechanism for internally perceived sound from an external source. Whether rare, experimental, or operational, the larger point is simple. If physics can generate a voice-like perception, psychiatry cannot dismiss every such report as fantasy on arrival. History is the graveyard of smug disbelief. This slide connects present concerns to earlier programs and controversies. MK Ultra, Project Bazaar, and the Moscow Signal. The lesson here is not that every modern claim is proven. The lesson is that governments have, in fact, explored covert influence, behavioral modification, and electromagnetic exposure in the past. Skepticism is healthy. Amnesia is not. When institutions say, "That sounds too extreme to be real," history often leans over and whispers, "Check the archives." Havana syndrome changed the public vocabulary. When diplomats, intelligence personnel, and officials reported voices, pressure, pain, balance issues, and other neurological symptoms, the response was no longer automatic ridicule. The slide argues that once elite personnel reported these effects, the possibility of directed energy injury entered official conversation. And that exposes a brutal double standard. When similar symptoms appear in a diplomat, it becomes a national security concern. When they appear in a civilian, it is too often treated as psychosis first and evidence later, if evidence is sought at all. This is the heart of the deck. It contrasts two profiles: organic schizophrenia and what the presentation calls neurotechnological targeting. On one side, earlier onset, vague or religious content, and a more typical medication response. On the other, later onset, technical or surveillance-themed content, repetition of real private information, medication resistance, and preserved cognition. The message here is not that every technically detailed complaint proves external causation. It is that clinicians should stop pretending the two profiles are indistinguishable. Good diagnosis begins with pattern recognition, not reflex dismissal. Here, the presentation attacks the old chemical imbalance narrative. Its claim is that psychiatry has over-relied on neurotransmitter explanations while under-investigating environmental and physical contributors. The slide points to the serotonin myth, critiques the way antipsychotics may sedate without addressing the cause, and argues that symptom suppression is not the same as a cure. In plain language, if the source of distress is external, then dopamine blockade may only tranquilize the witness while leaving the mechanism untouched. A sedated patient is not the same thing as a solved case. This slide is a warning flare. If a patient is not primarily psychotic, then aggressive psychiatric medication can become a second injury layered on top of the first. The presentation emphasizes brain volume loss, cognitive dulling, emotional blunting, and metabolic risks associated with long-term antipsychotic use. The moral center of the slide is the phrase, "do no harm." When a person under possible external assault is chemically flattened, their ability to observe, document, resist, and testify may degrade. In that scenario, treatment stops being protection and starts looking like collateral damage. Now the deck zooms out from symptoms to systems. It sketches a loop among military or intelligence interests, psychiatry, and the pharmaceutical industry, with secrecy, chronic treatment, and social discredit reinforcing each other. Whether one accepts that whole model or not, the strategic logic is clear. Institutions protect themselves. Bureaucracies hate anomalies that threaten budgets, reputations, or doctrine. So the inconvenient witness gets relabeled, the case gets contained, and the machine keeps humming. Silence is rarely random. Usually, it has a payroll. This slide pulls in the language of cognitive warfare. The claim is stark. Modern conflict increasingly targets perception, behavior, cognition, and decision-making, not just bodies and buildings. If military doctrine openly discusses influencing the human brain and shaping behavior, then medical professionals cannot act as though reports of remote influence automatically belong to delusion. The battlefield has moved inward. And once the brain becomes terrain, the old line between psychiatry, neurology, security, and ethics starts to blur. That is exactly why lazy diagnosis becomes dangerous. This section expands the threat from overt attack to extraction. Consumer neurotechnology, brain-computer interfaces, and neural data ecosystems are advancing faster than regulation can. The slide argues that mental privacy, once assumed to be inviolable, is becoming negotiable. Neural data can reveal emotional states, vulnerabilities, behavioral tendencies, and possibly far more than the public understands. And once that data enters corporate clouds, it becomes attractive to advertisers, insurers, and state actors. The fear once dismissed as science fiction starts to look less like paranoia and more like a badly regulated business model. This slide uses a case study to make a forensic point. The subject, a technically literate weapons professional, reportedly described microwave hearing and sleep deprivation in precise technical language. The deck's argument is that the complaint's specificity should have triggered an investigation, not a blanket psychiatric dismissal. When a trained person uses exact terminology, that is not proof, but it is evidence of relevance. Medicine should know the difference. If a patient names a mechanism with unusual clarity, the next step should be testing the environment, not stapling delusion to the file and calling it a day. This is one of the darker slides, and probably one of the strongest rhetorically. It presents a four-step sequence: surveillance, reaction, discredit, neutralization. First, the target experiences intrusion. Then they report it. Then, the police or doctors reinterpret the report as psychiatric instability. Then come the consequences: revoked clearance, job loss, forced medication, and social isolation. The key argument is that diagnosis can function as a silencer. Once a person is framed as unreliable, the system no longer has to answer to their evidence. It only has to manage them. Here, the presentation turns from critique to protocol. The proposed standard is simple: investigate before medicating, listen for technical specificity, conduct environmental sweeps, test shielding claims, consider anomalous health incidents and directed energy possibilities before defaulting to schizophrenia. Whether every item on the checklist proves out is almost secondary to the ethical pivot it represents. It restores medicine to inquiry. It tells clinicians to become investigators again, not just symptom suppressors. In a fog of uncertainty, the honorable move is not instant certainty. It is disciplined curiosity. The closing message is moral, not merely technical. Science advances by studying anomalies, not mocking them. Medicine is supposed to shield the vulnerable, not collaborate with systems that erase them. This presentation argues that we are entering an era in which neuro-warfare, cognitive manipulation, and mental privacy are no longer fringe concepts. If that is even partly true, then the diagnosis must adapt. The documents matter. The technology matters. And above all, the patient in front of you matters. Sometimes the bravest clinical act is not to explain away the impossible, but to investigate it.